I have the great fortune of working in a field that is about telling stories, about human meaning, about the myriad of different ways that we do that, whether that's through dance, whether that's through visual arts, whether that's through writing, whether that's through music. It's a great life. I've never been bored for a second. I've never looked at my clock and said, how am I going to make it to 5 o'clock? This is a great privilege that those of us that work in this sector have. One thing that I'd like to sort of challenge you with just right out of the gate, and Scott laid out a whole series of challenges that I may or may not challenge you with, and if I miss any of them, he'll challenge you over a drink later on those topics, is that we're all artists. And one of the big divides for us, and as we've eroded arts education, we've lost sight of this, is that, you know, with the aesthetic gap that tends to exist, that we tend to create within the arts sector between the audience and us, people often lose sight of their own creative potential. And what I mean by that is when we're born, we are born with a rhythmic instrument that is our body. We respond to pitch, we respond to rhythm, because that is what it is to be human. So the arts are not some aesthetic out there concept, but rather something that's very innate, something that's very much a part of who we are as people. And as artists and as arts leaders, I think it's our job to awaken that sense in people rather than just encouraging people to buy tickets. Tickets, don't get me wrong, pay the bills and so on, but it's really, really critical that everyone has that sense. And as we talk about creative economies and diversifying in that way, creating the sense of creative potential within every human being should really be our aim. So, one question that I've been asked a lot lately is, where are the arts going? And we have many smart people in this room who probably have a better answer to that than I do. And I've answered that question in kind of a coy way generally. I've said, well, if I knew that, I'd be working with Steve Jobs and we'd be recrafting the world. Well, I think the answer is arts are going everywhere. With technology changing the way we interface with life, artistic content and our capacity to relate to it, to create art, is really going everywhere. And that's exciting. That, you know, we could be living in a golden age, a very positive, optimistic age of artistic creativity and potential. And if you talk to many people in the arts sector, and certainly if you go to arts conferences, what you'll hear is a lot of kind of negative energy as we struggle to adapt existing business models to a changing reality. I think all of us can remember 10 years ago when the recording industry was going through its transitions as new opportunities to engage in downloading music and connecting with music became online, and to change that sector radically. That's happening in the rest of the arts now. So we're kind of 10 years behind, but the opportunities are there. So I think really, rather than thinking pessimistically about the arts and are struggling to retain business practice and business models that may now be outmoded, rather our focus should be on reaching into these new areas, to exploiting new technologies to reach everywhere. So I think we're dealing with a really optimistic, positive environment for the arts in our country. In the United States, some of you may know that there's been a lot of discussion about supply and demand. There's this sort of huge interest in the economics of arts. And someone has actually said in the US, I won't name him, that there's too much supply. But if you think about that, there's too much art. You know, can there ever be too much art? You know, yes, we have struggling business models. Can there ever be too many lakes? Can there ever be too much air? Of course, there can never be too much art. And so we are struggling to adapt our business models, but that does not mean art is not succeeding. That does not mean that art is not transforming lives every day all around us. So there is no doubt that we are in a period of incredible transition, but that the opportunities that exist are very exciting for the arts sector. So I'm going to leave you with 3 recommendations at the end today. I'll start with them now just so you can see them, and then I'll move through a little bit of a history, some case studies from my own personal experience, and then hopefully loop back and you'll all agree that these are maybe good ideas for Canada to pursue. The first is that we redo the Massey Commission. So this is not my idea by any stretch. This is something that has been discussed in the arts community. For those of you that don't know, the Massey Commission took place between 1949 and 1951 and produced a series of recommendations that really led to the forming of the Canada Council. Many of the mechanisms that we enjoy today in terms of how arts is funded, how arts are created in this country. From 1951 to now, a little bit has changed. 60 years. There's a lot of change in terms of cultural diversity, technology, and so on. It may be time to revisit that. The second is we need to reimagine arts education. We have lost arts education. We have talked at great length about creative economies and the importance of transitioning from an industrial economy to a creative economy. And yet, at the same time, we've eroded arts education in our public school system. We need to reimagine that, and I'll get to that a little bit later in the talk. On an ongoing basis, we need a cultural policy think tank. We need an independent, privately funded think tank that can explore new ideas, that can look at global best practice in a non-self-interested way. We don't have that in Canada. The reason parts of the Massey Commission are a little bit outdated now is because we haven't been able to update them with a series of objective recommendations about where art is going. And finally, I'll leave you with a couple of ideas for how you might engage in the arts. I know some of you are heavily involved already running arts organizations as I scan the room, but some of you may have other opportunities in terms of how you might engage. So those are the recommendations: Massey Commission, Arts Education, Cultural Policy Think Tank. In terms of a brief history leading us to where we are today, we have thousands of years of art history. So, getting back to my point about art being innate, at some point our ancestors crawled into caves and scratched drawings on walls. This is what we have done for thousands of years. We will continue to do this, whether or not all of our art forms continue to exist into the future. Art will still be created. Art will still be a central occupation of humanity, the central outpouring of our senses of meaning, of belief, and so on. Over time, of course, art has changed. We've seen the rise of folk art. We've seen the church institutionalize art. We've seen salons. We've seen the concert venue. We've seen radio. We've seen television. We've seen the internet. So the notion that we are living in a period of unprecedented change in terms of speed may be true, but over the history of our artistic output, we have been through many, many disruptive changes. So the internet, iPads, whatever Steve Jobs unfurls 5 years hence to change our lives, will continue forever. So we as artists need to adapt to that changing reality, and we have over the course of time. Dating back 60 years, just to zoom in a little more closely, as I mentioned, 1949 to 1951, we had the Massey Commission, which led to the recommendations, again, that led to the Canada Council. What that commission was about 160 public meetings across the country, 1,200 artists engaged to talk about visioning for Canada. And it was largely routed in two major themes. And one of them is still very familiar. One was, how do we protect ourselves from the great American giant next door? Again, that really hasn't changed all that much. And the second was, how do we build a sense of national identity, national brand? And at the time, we didn't want to be seen as lumberjacks and maple syrup, beaver representative type country. We wanted to show ourselves as being something that could compete head to head with Europe. And so a lot of our art forms that were created around those times were largely Eurocentric, reflecting our population at the time, and were really designed to show Europe that we could compete with them. So that was 60 years ago. We moved through this nation-building discussion, which was, again, diversifying away from the sort of commodity-based view that most people had of Canada as being this big, cold rock, towards city-building strategy. So every city needed a symphony orchestra, every city needed a ballet company. We saw proliferation of these things. There are 23 professional funded orchestras in Ontario, for example, as we saw these things proliferate out. We moved from that to the city-building agenda, which has really sort of reached its apex, I think, in a way, in the publishing of The Rise of the Creative Class in 2002 under Richard Florida. So we've moved through this 60-year history talking about Canadian cultural content, where all of the arguments for why we invest in it have been driven by something else. So we invest in art to build a nation. We invest in art to build a better city. We invest in art because it's good for economic development and tourism. But we as a country haven't really had the discussion about what art and culture means to us. What is Canadian culture? In that same 60-year period, what else happened? Well, we saw a huge shift in how art was funded. As we discussed earlier, the private sector growth is tremendous. Some in the arts have pushed back on me when I've suggested this, but the factual truth is from 1991 to 2009 in Toronto, the fastest growing revenue source for artists and arts organizations was private sector, far outstripping the average growth of the sector, actually. And in fact, the whole uptick of the arts sector in Toronto has been disproportionately and largely funded by private sector supporters. So that's changed a lot, certainly in the last 20 years. We've seen a little bit of a cultural change in Toronto from 1951 to now. Undoubtedly, we have a radically different city. And so are the models that we're using now reflecting that diversity? Are they resulting in our investing in the communities that we have built in our fair city today? We've obviously seen huge changes in how people connect with their society, particularly in the last 3 years, but even beyond that. There have been massive changes in terms of what it means to be a global citizen. Globalization does not avoid sectors, so it's relevant for us in the arts as well. Looking specifically at the last 10 years in Toronto, in 1998, 58% of our public schools in the TDSB had music teachers. So even at that point, 98, this is 13 years ago, we were less than 60% of our students, of our children had access to music teachers. If you want to talk about dance and visual arts and other things, much lower percentage than that. In the late 90s, I don't have it on me, I'm a compulsive BlackBerry addict. I was doing my MBA in Waterloo, and you can see me sort of compulsively reach for the holster. The BlackBerry was born, and I remember that. I don't know how many of you remember the little two-line BlackBerries back in the early stages. But the rise of that technology, it's not that old. These things haven't been around forever, even though it feels like it. And certainly for my wife, she feels that she lost me in that year to that form of technology. 2001, September 11th, radically changed how our cultural community works. We basically lost the whole US market, which was driving a lot of our cultural tourism. 2003, SARS hit us, which was another sort of blight on Toronto in terms of a foreign destination. In the same period, 04, 05, we saw the emergence of the superbuild projects. So we saw massive cultural infrastructure. In a context where technology was changing again, how people were interacting with cultural content. So we built a lot of buildings that cost a lot of money to maintain and operate in a period where it wasn't about the building as much anymore. It was more about the content and where the content could go. In the case of the institutions that I've run, the ballet school saw $1.8 million operating cost on utilities and alone in terms of running a larger facility. That's money that we're not spending on art, that we're spending on utilities costs. Huge changes in terms of requirements. In 2007, of course, the global recession hits and the Canadian dollar goes up, which again changes the dynamics in terms of how our art market works in terms of our foreign advantages. Certainly the Canadian dollar has better purchasing power, but those foreign tourists that we were struggling to maintain are no longer attracted to our discounted prices with the 65-cent dollar. A lot of my colleagues in the arts who've seen declines in single ticket purchases and subscriptions in the last 3 years like to believe, and I hope they're right and I hope I'm wrong, that it's been the recession that's driven our challenges economically. But if you think about it, July 2008 was when the first digital media app was sold. That's how old that business is. I think in February, Apple had sold 10 billion apps online. And these apps, for those of you that don't know, they can consume you completely. If you download one, you're lost for many, many hours. So I wonder, and I'm worried, that a lot of us are waiting for the recession to be over and for the return of those subscription sales, the return of the single ticket purchase. I'm not sure that's coming. And then we ended this sort of 10-year period. We'd started with 58% of our public school students having access to music teachers. At the end of 2008, we were down to 48%. So in that whole 10-year period where we're talking about creative economies, Richard Florida moves to Toronto, creativity is important, we continue to undermine our arts education programming. Why have we done that? In large part because we in the arts sector, and I'll take responsibility, have used the creative economy argument to argue for building more consumption opportunities. So again, we think your view, or that the view of the perspective of the public, should be one of purchasing product from us. And so creative economies is all about building huge surplus, huge amounts of entertainment that you then buy, rather than it being about arts education, more the fundamentals of how people get access, how we democratize access to the creative capacity. So instead of just purchasing things, rather you're equipped, and kids are equipped today with the opportunity to learn how to actually build and create art. So where are we today? Well, we've had a whole series of obscure instrumental arguments. So when you talk to the general public, when you talk to regular people, the average suburban voter, and about the arts, they don't really get what we're about. And I think, frankly, I'm not sure we really get what we're about in terms of why we exist. Is it nation building? Is it city building? Is it economic development? Is it something else? We haven't had that discussion, I don't think, as a country. We've seen radical shifts in the business models, where it used to be government funding disproportionately, and now to run an arts organization, you have to be a government relations specialist, you have to be a fundraiser, you have to be a business developer, you have to be a digital media savvy. It's quite difficult. Radical cultural diversification over the last 60 years, huge technological change, and generally our arts organizations do not have the resources to innovate and experiment. We're so busy carrying the legacy of what is that it's very difficult for us to put forth new investment to try out things, and certainly to try something that might fail is almost non-existent. So creative sector with limited capacity to experiment and innovate, which is a real challenge. So building forward on the arts, give you a bit of a personal case study on myself and how I got into this and what I've learned from a couple different organizations. Again, I don't claim to have all the answers here, but I think I've had some interesting experiences in my short career. I grew up in Winnipeg, which is a very cold place to grow up. Grew up in a sports family, ended up getting sucked into the High School Musical. This is pre-Glee. But I had a similar experience as all those kids did, not that I was sort of singing like mad everywhere in the halls all the time, but close to that. Fell in love with music. I was not raised in an artistic family particularly. My dad loved to sing Roger Whittaker songs, and sort of fell in love with music theater, which led into opera. And opera was a new thing for me. It was a new thing for my family. It was very strange. And at the end of my opera schooling, I was considering what I would do next. Certainly loved life as an artist and would love to have pursued that. Started noticing that a lot of the arts organizations I was working with at the time, the way they presented things was very, the word that has been used that is very loaded for people in the arts community, elitist. And what I mean by that, again, is I have gone to shows, having been the Dean of the Royal Conservatory of Music and Executive Director of the National Ballet School. I've gone to recitals where the house program I read, and I can't understand what it says. So we know that our audience today probably did not have any music education. Certainly a large part of them did not, large percentage of our audience. And yet, the way we promote ourselves, the way we present ourselves is almost completely without sort of any navigational possibility for somebody who's not already initiated. We also know that the people who do buy our product buy a lot of it. So if we're going to grow, odds are if you go to the symphony, you're involved with the ballet, you're involved with the opera, like those people that are already there are not going to buy more stuff because they're already buying a lot. So if we're going to grow the arts, we need to grow it by attracting new audiences, and that requires a different approach. So the reason I did the MBA was because I thought this would be a good way for me to contribute back. I had gone through this huge personal voyage from being somebody who did not have arts in my background to someone who fell in love with opera. And I thought I might have some skill in terms of talking through people who might not be so arts friendly into being arts friendly, which certainly in my recent volunteer role has been a very important skill. I fundraised for a year for Opera Ontario, as you heard, which was an interesting transition from singing into arts management. Landed the job as assistant dean of the community school, and then a year later I was promoted to be dean, and I was 27 years old. And at the time, I think I got the job because I was prematurely gray. I'm not sure there was a whole lot of merit for a reason for me to have it, and it was kind of surreal to be around these great artists and be that age. RCM, of course, was founded in 1886 as one of the world's great arts education and training institutions. It was a huge honor for me to be there. Why did I want to be involved with arts education? Certainly the jobs, the more glamorous jobs in the arts tend to be around the performing arts, but I've always loved the process and engagement. So that was the sort of draw for me in arts education. Arts in Toronto at that time, this was 1998-99, was pre-super build, all Eurocentric art. So everything you saw was sort of Western, classical, everything. There were a few exceptions. Harbourfront Centre, of course, did some interesting work. And certainly if you talk to a lot of people from diverse ethnic communities in Toronto, there's a real feeling of being locked out from participating in arts and culture life. We did a capital campaign assessment. So I've been involved in 2 of the capital campaigns, which is again why I'm now 37 and look 55, where we looked at the student base of the conservatory. And so here's an institution, we're in Toronto, the world's most ethnically diverse city. I'm speaking around the world and people are wanting to know, how do you run a conservatory in such a diverse context? And we did a survey of our student base to try to figure out, okay, well, what kind of population did we have? And what we discovered at the time was we had an incredibly affluent population, which when you're about to embark on a capital campaign is a good thing. But we also found from a cultural diversity standpoint that using, the definition that was used in '63 was ethno-racial, and which basically at that point meant non-white. Using the same metric for the conservatory in the early 2000s, we were at 3%. 3% of the student base as compared to the general population, which was about 50% of the time. So we were leaving a lot of people behind, and we needed to do something to address that. We also know that arts education is a clear predictor of ongoing participation in the cultural life of the community, whether that's as a creator or as a potential audience member. And so if we are leaving people behind, if they're not getting access within their public school system, and if our community arts organizations like the conservatory are not reflective of that diversity, we're leaving out huge chunks of our population from this opportunity. So what did we do about it, and what did we learn? Well, the first thing we did was we launched a World Music Center in 2003, which at the time was quite groundbreaking. In fact, it wasn't particularly groundbreaking to have world music in 2003, but anyhow, we'll take it. made terrible, terrible, terrible mistakes in launching this thing. And the big ones were, we at the conservatory looked at certain communities and thought, wouldn't it be great to have a traditional Chinese music program? So we would go into the community, we'd quickly identify some faculty, hire them, and off we go, without taking time to ask, how is culture passed from generation to generation in your community? Where should this fit in your community? Does it make sense for it to be downtown or somewhere else? So we learned a lot very quickly. Our intentions were good. Our execution was poor. So we learned a lot in the first year and a half, and certainly by the end of that year and a half, it would take typically 10 to 12 months of community consultation prior to launching things to make sure we were hiring the right people, it was in the right location, it was designed for the right purpose. The second program we launched was a Bridge to Toronto Communities, which was a program that was really aimed, this was around the year of the gun, where we were aiming to find youth at risk and deliver programs that would be meaningful to them. There we made an equally large series of assumptions that were incorrect. The first being we would find communities that, in one case, there was a pocket of Cameroonian young people who wanted a program. So we found this incredible Cameroonian percussionist, and we parachuted him in. But the mistake we made, again, they're trying to be very sensitive, was we didn't actually ask people what they wanted. We sort of made assumptions, being so politically correct and Canadian, that they were from Cameroon, and so of course if we had a great Cameroonian artist, why wouldn't they be the perfect person to teach? And what we actually ended up finding in a lot of those communities is when we asked them is they wanted a string quartet program or they wanted the core product of what the conservatory had. So anyhow, what did we learn overall? We learned that legacy is very heavy. A lot of our arts organizations, we are carrying huge amounts of legacy, which is a great part of what we are, a great part of our brand. People have a lot of baggage around these institutions and what they represent. In some cases, one story I'll never forget, I was one Sunday afternoon at a Portuguese Alliance, which is a meeting of soccer clubs from the Portuguese community in Toronto. And a man stood up and I'd said, basically, I'm here to listen to you. You tell me what you think, what kind of programming you think would make sense. We'll provide the platform, the training, etc. And he stood up and said, when he arrived in Canada in the late 60s, he brought his kids to the Royal Conservatory of Music. And he was told by a faculty member there that he did not belong there. And so that's some of the history that we're dealing with. The conservatory is not that kind of place now, but people remember that kind of thing. So we have a lot of healing, a lot of makeup to do. Community engagement and consultation is absolutely critical to what we do. Again, the growth market for us is the non-participant. Who's not involved? How do we get them involved? How do we make those connections? That the socio-cultural context is important. That art, if you look at it as this aesthetically separated idea, without framing art in its creation, its transmission in the social context, you actually miss most of the great learnings around art. And that ultimately partnership and shared social vision is possible if you approach these things in the right way. In 2006, at the age of 33, I'm going to have a glass of water here. I moved on to become co-CEO of the ballet school, which the joke at the time was because I didn't know how to dance and I'm a terrible dancer. This was a great opportunity to stretch myself, and indeed it has been. 4 years of adult ballet, anyone can start at any age. I'm a personal testament to that fact. So I arrived at the ballet school midway through the super build projects, which again, people don't realize what we've been through. It's an incredible amount of cultural build out in this city. These institutions are fantastic. They are struggling to make the transition to realizing themselves as larger organizations and struggling to adapt. We'd built a huge facility, a tremendous facility, but the year before I arrived, we had a $2.75 million operating deficit. So imagine being a young arts leader and arriving to run an institution, being ready to sort of take the steering wheel, and you're dealing with bankruptcy and solvency, all these kinds of fun topics at board meetings. I don't wish anyone, I wish that on anyone. We were starting to discover that public engagement was becoming more and more critical to what we were doing at the school as well. So this is actually quite important in terms of arts activity. Arts organizations tend to be built around the notion of sort of an artistic hierarchy, and that there's some super artistic figure who ultimately makes decisions for what people want. And we started to notice that that was shifting over time, largely driven through different channels for creating and consuming. In terms of the funding models for arts organizations, how were those shifting? Well, I mentioned the growth. Average sector growth in Toronto, so these are all the municipally funded organizations added together in the last 18 years, has been 144%. So going back to 1999 to 2009, 144% growth rate. Earned revenues, that's ticket sales, retail, anything we sell, is 138%. Federal and provincial is 117%. And municipal growth is a paltry 38%. So municipal funding has barely kept pace with inflation for those 18 years. Federal and provincial has been slightly better. But all of those three revenue classes, earned revenue, government funding of all three levels of government, is below the average growth of the sector. Private sector growth in the same period is 248%. So if the average is 144, all of the other revenues are below the average. Private sector support has actually been responsible for the uplift of the sector in the last 18 years. So when I say that, and the arts community reacts, I'm saying that based on fact. I'm not sort of suggesting that we should not be reliant or not be somewhat reliant on government funding, but rather that what we're seeing is successful organizations are really being built around engagement with the private sector. The other big shift that we were seeing at the time was around the sort of interactive gaming. 97% of American teens play games regularly. I remember being a young person growing up in Winnipeg, and people would talk with horror that we were watching on average 2 hours of TV. I don't know if you remember that. The average Canadian kid is watching 2 hours. Imagine the sedentary lifestyle. Well, the stat now is American teenagers are spending 7 hours a day interacting with digital media. So this is a big deal. And typically, I'm glad to see the TDSB reverse this decision, but typically school boards will say, well, don't use your social media in the classroom. Well, this is where the kids live nowadays. So we need to be mindful of that in terms of our cultural content. And of course, when I arrived at the ballet school, the final factor is arts education was sort of in a sort of nosedive. And we've improved it slightly in the last couple of years, but just barely. So what do we do to respond? How do we deal with these issues? On the deficit issue, well, we hired great talent like Arlen and basically raised our revenues from 10 to 20 million through the recession. We built our endowment from 8 to 37 million through the recession. So we just pretended the recession wasn't happening. We actually remember having this meeting and saying, well, we can't really afford to have a recession now, so let's just not have one. Which I think, frankly, you kind of need to do. Arts organizations need to be aspirational. There's no point in our existing if we're not aspirational. And certainly when arts organizations tend to run into that deficit thing, the knee-jerk reaction is always, well, we'll cut expense. Well, cut expense means less marketing or less artistic content. And frankly, that's just sort of a slow, steady decline into non-existence. So you can't really deal with the arts in that way. And in fact, generally our issues in the arts are a revenue problem, not an expense problem. On the digital media side, I don't know if any of you have participated in our flash mobs, but we launched a whole series of flash mobs in the last couple of years using, everyone knows what a flash mob is, yes? No? Flash mob is sort of this random, spontaneous, large-scale act of dance. And so last year we did one with the music of Leslie Feist, choreographed. We had 350 people show up at the Eaton Center, age 7 to 82. Poof, they all sort of dancing. We even choreographed the fountain to go off at a certain moment. This current year we did one for kids and one for adults. And the kids version, which we uploaded, all the video for learning these dances is online and available for free. So if you decide at the end of tonight, I really want to create my own community flash mob, you could go and do that. We had schools in Newfoundland, we had schools in South Africa take this dance and learn it. So they're uploaded versions of these dances from all around the world. So what we can do with this in terms of an educational context, an educational theory, we can actually build Canadian dances for the entire nation, put them up online and have every public school compete in them, every public school create their own version. On the arts education side, we built digital platforms. We built a national network of dance schools called wanttodance.ca. When we started, we didn't know how many dance schools there were in the country. We now have 1,200 dance schools registered, representing 750,000 dancers across the country. Art is big business. Cultural entrepreneurship. When I first started talking about this last year, and certainly right around the time the mayoral appointment came to be, there was a lot of pushback from the arts community about this. And what do we mean by cultural entrepreneurship? Well, what we basically mean is we want artists to be paid. And a lot of artists will say, it's not all about the money. Why does it have to be all about the money? It does not have to be all about the money if you don't want to be paid for it. Art can be a voluntary activity. It's a fantastic thing. I've run a community choir for 6 years in my home that I didn't get paid for and people didn't pay for. That's fantastic. It's not all about the money. That was beautiful. That was transformative. But generally, we need artists to be paid. In Canada, the average dancer earns $18,000 a year. That's not good enough. We can't have sustainable artistic careers around that. So we need to equip the arts community with the business skill sets to be able to know how to fundraise, to know how to build business models and so on. This is a different reality. Back at post-Massey Commission, that wasn't as necessary. It's necessary now. So what lessons have we learned at the ballet school? We need to balance tradition and innovation. I tend to be I like everything tomorrow, and you can't always do that with organizations in general. Business skills need to be part of the arts training process, and we have opportunities everywhere. If we're imaginative in the arts, if we look for partnerships, they are there. So at the end of my experience at the ballet school, some of you will remember that Rob Ford became our mayor. I didn't know the mayor before the election, and managed, much to my surprise, and I think everyone else's, get a call from him based on a Canadian business article that my friend Beryl helped hook me up with. You're to blame for this, Beryl. So generally, I remember the first meeting with his chief of staff at the time, and his chief of staff said, well, what we really need is someone to come in and to take the arts from here in spending to here in spending. And I said, good luck finding somebody in the arts community that will help you do that. And I said, well, here's the reasons why you shouldn't. And I talked a lot about the social merits actually about the arts, and then obviously the business returns. And generally, for every dollar the city puts in, and this is based on audited statements, the arts sector generates $17. And that's not economic externalities, that's not the restaurant business, that's not the hotel, that's the actual real return generated within the audited statements of arts organizations. So obviously it does not make sense. It does not make economic sense to reduce spending. In the period from November to now, I've managed to send Michael Posner, who wrote the article in the Globe, got it half right. I had actually sent 3,000 emails. I think it's about 6,000 in terms of inflow and outflow. So I think I've probably heard every idea, good and bad, that's out there in the arts sector. So thank you for all of you who sent in your thoughts. I've probably read 6 feet of cultural policy documents, and have probably had the privilege of meeting 3 or 4 artists and arts organizations every day for the last 7 months, which has been incredible, because really when I started, I thought I had a bit of a sense of what I didn't know, and just the sector is so tremendous, and I've met so many tremendous people who really make such a difference in our community. As was mentioned earlier, where did this go in 6 months? For those of you that remember November, there was a lot of fear. There was a lot of worry about what having Rob Ford for mayor would mean for the arts community. In the period between now and then, chaired actually by Robert Foster, Karen Kane, and Jim Prentice, we've created a culture plan called Creative Capital Gains. What's important about this culture plan? Well, it has the key ingredients that you need, and I've read 40 of these from American cities. And generally, the first and foremost thing is investment in cultural funding. So for a good culture plan, for a successful city, we need content, not surprisingly. Without funding, there's no content. The second area is really around public access. So one of the challenges that is still facing our city that the culture plan I don't think addresses as much as it might, and we need to work on together, is how do we make sure that culture is accessible to people? And I think technology is a help, but the truth of it is we have some of the most expensive arts organizations in Toronto on the planet. Certainly some of the major institutions. If you look at them relative to other cities, they're very expensive. And it's not because we want them to be expensive. Like none of us, the art gallery does not want to have to charge the fees that it charges. I'm sure the ROM doesn't either. But relative to European models, relative to American models where there's a lot more private sector investment, these are more publicly accessible institutions than we have. We haven't animated our public spaces, our investment in public realm. People talk about Chicago. Well, we don't have that sense of energy around our public spaces the way some of these cities do. So we need to do that better. All that being said, the culture plan had the input of 500 artists, 13 public sessions. So here we are, 6-7 months into Rob Ford's mayoral period. We presented it last Wednesday, and it was for the first time ever we had a culture plan unanimously supported by City Council. Unanimously. Thank you very much. So what it was actually quite surprising to me that it was unanimous, and I've talked to all the people involved, and I think right up to the end we weren't totally sure what was going to happen, but seeing the screen of all the green votes was pretty wonderful. And so this included people like the mayor voting in support, Mike Del Grande, who's the budget chief, voting in support. This is fantastic. So in terms of the future of the arts in the city, I think we have a plan. I think we've got a good plan. And I think all of those people that were involved in co-chairing it, particularly Robert Foster, who did such a great job of stick handling the thing, and Rita Davies in the culture division, are really to be applauded for their work. Interestingly, though, we got almost no coverage on this thing. So back in November, when the sky was falling, when I was appointed and I made reference to private sector investment, everyone freaked out. We got lots of coverage on that. But we moved the council 7 months to a unanimously supported culture plan and almost no mention at all. So I'm not sure why that is. I'm sure there's more interest in sort of the acrimony at City Hall than in that. But that's not good for our city, frankly. Like, that's a good news story. And yes, there are other things going on that need to be covered, but personal little pet peeve on that. And I think for the people that did all the work in moving that agenda along, that was a bit of a slap in the face. So what have I learned in the past 6, 7 months? Politics is really tough. We judge these people very quickly. Having met pretty much all the councillors at this point, I have a lot of admiration for all of those people. I don't politically agree with many of them, but the amount of time and energy they put into these things is incredible. And really pulling one sentence out of what they might say today and basically saying that's the kind of person that individual is really not fair. I know this sounds Pollyanna-ish and so on, but if we want to create a vision for a better society, for a better arts community, we need to sort of give people a little bit of an opportunity to prove themselves. And certainly I think the mayor over the course of the 7 months, at least with respect to arts and culture, has really been true to his word. And we've got this, again, unanimously supported culture plan for the first time in the city's history as a result of a lot of arts leaders working with him and trying to create a shared common space. That openness and a spirit of collaboration can overcome a lot of differences. That we all want a better city. We can come together to work on it. And the community really is amazing. So what you know of the arts community generally, if you read the papers, is scratching the surface of the 1,200 arts organizations that exist in this city. So get out there and get to know them. So now that you've traveled my journey with me to some degree, I hope you'll agree that art is really fundamental to all of us. That part of the conversation that we need to have is really around reimagining what role art and culture plays in all of our individual lives. That our business models are adapting fast, really fast. And I'm somebody who's got an arts background and an MBA. Most arts leaders do not have that business training. It's very, very difficult to run these organizations. So we need sort of new visioning around how they run and how they change. That cultural diversity is a tremendous opportunity. We need to make more of it. And then, of course, technology is creating incredible opportunities for us to reach more and more people. So finally, in closing, in my last few minutes, my recommendations: the Massey Commission is 60 years old. It's time for us to redo it. I think we've got the kind of collective spirit in the country to make that happen now. And we have such complexity of issues and opportunities facing us that we really need to reimagine it. That we need to launch an ongoing privately funded cultural policy think tank that can really experiment, that can incubate some new ideas and best practices. That our arts education needs to be reimagined. We don't just need to reintroduce the arts education that was there 25 years ago. And I'll read you this one quote from a book called The Third Teacher, which was recently published by Bruce Mao and Canon Design by Carl Fish, who's an educator. We are currently preparing students for jobs that don't yet exist, using technologies that haven't been invented in order to solve problems we don't even know are problems yet. That's the kind of creativity we need in our young people today. That's the kind of future that they're facing. And to not have arts education as a central part of their upbringing, as a non-core subject, as an appreciation subject where it exists, is not enough. And finally, what can you do? I think artists are getting much more focused on small is beautiful, on intimate. The one thing that I'm seeing as an emerging trend that I'm sure many of you are seeing, is the notion of salons. How you use your home, how you use your space. So I'd encourage you all, if you've always wanted to study an instrument, if you always wanted to study a dance form or any art form, to go out and do it, no time like the present. Find an artist, host them in your home, invite some people who might buy their stuff, who might donate. You need to get involved in supporting these young people and these emerging artists. And I think we've got all of the right ingredients in Toronto. I think Canada has the right combination of imagination, creativity, diversity, and opportunity. So I just encourage us all to try to create a shared vision for how we might realize the full potential of our country and our city. Thank you very much.
surprised to hear you talk about autonomous and private in the same sentence. Do you really believe that privately funded is autonomous?
I do, but I think you have to look at what sort of strings come attached to these things.
Yeah, those attachments frequently are there, and
yeah, I have to tell you, in my experience, and I've just been involved in these two large capital campaigns, there have been a number of private supporters that have been very hands-off with large gifts. And I actually think in many respects the banks as well are actually fairly good about this kind of thing. So I think there is a sort of a skepticism around private sector money being autonomous. But my finding is it's always been more flexible and free in terms of how it's used than government funding is.
I'm sure there are instances of that, yes. Thank you.
You've suggested every time you've been asked that there cannot be such a thing as too much art.
Mm-hmm.
And while it is true that if you define artistic experience as the experience that doesn't need to be paid for, then either actively or passively, then that's fine. But obviously the fact that you mentioned that the average salary of a dancer is $18,000, the average salary of an artist in general in Canada is about $30,000. I don't quite see how your idea of teaching artists to be entrepreneurs is going to alleviate this problem. We know that artists have grown in numbers over the last 30, 40 years. Many more people feel free to want to be artists, to be free, autonomous, and yet the market doesn't support the numbers. So will you, in the end, answer the question whether or not it's possible for there to be too many artists?
I think one thing we don't do is we're not realistic with people when they're being professionally trained. So one of the things I like actually quite a lot about the dance community is there aren't a pile of dance schools in Canada, in large part because of the physical demands of dance are so extreme and that people do get hurt doing this. And I found the ballet school to be very clear about professional potential and actually telling students along the way that they're not tracking to careers. Many artistic disciplines don't ever do that. And in fact, the music schools, not all of them, but some of them, are in the business of telling everyone they're going to be a performer, because if you have 400 students and they all want to be a performer, your odds of having the one success story, which actually make the name of your school, are higher. Well, the reality is you leave 399 other people in these terrible life circumstances where you haven't been very realistic about it. So I would always suggest that people are realistic, but I do think people come out at the end of many training programs with the sense that there's something out there that's just going to fall into place to take care of them, and that's more and more not true. And the people that do well are the people that sort of find ways to create new things, new business models, new approaches to this. And I think we've seen great success stories. Not that everyone's going to be a Cirque du Soleil, but I think arguably if you'd go back 25 years and say to someone, the greatest cultural export from Canada is going to be a circus, people would have thought you were crazy. And yet here was a group that reimagined how it could be delivered. I think dance, La 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 Human Steps was an example of a similar kind of reimagination. So I think there's some of that. And that's not to say every artist is going to be lifted above the poverty line, but I think if you're realistic about it and you provide people with the sense that part of their job is to be a great artist and part of it is to build on the legacy of the past, your odds of success are greater.
If you're talking about an entrepreneurial environment where big business will invest in smaller companies in performing arts and literary arts and such, how much of an impact do you think return on investment makes? Like, what's going to happen to art forms that are already marginalized? Like, for example, like poetry.
I think part of the challenge is trying to, again, reimagine context for these. I've seen things that were incredibly obscure be hugely successful. And I think sometimes we're the victims of our own sort of approach to selling these things. And I'm not saying that every poetry fest will be full to the rafters and so on, but I think the notion that anything is a dying art is only true if the people around it accept it and refuse to adapt to a changing environment. So my finding has been, from the private sector at least, that framing opportunity for people. Like if you talk to people who've earned a lot of money in their lives and say, here's a young poet, and you can invest in creating brand new work. You can invest in contemporary dance in a world premiere of a new show. You can use your surplus cash that you've built up in a life of business to do that. People support it. And so the question for, I think, the poet might be, how do we as a sector help you meet some people that might be naturally inclined to support you? And our historic view on private sector as an entire arts community has been, once a donor comes in, like if Scott comes to my thing, I don't want Scott to meet anybody else, because Scott may actually like somebody else more. Well, that's not why we got into the arts. We got into the arts because we saw the personal transformation and so on. So if you're a poet, and I've got a friend who is a supporter who might support you, I should be helping you do that. And that's not been part of the sort of philosophy around the arts sector, and it needs to be more so. We need to see each other, ourselves, as stewards for the broader arts community rather than representatives of one institution.
You spoke so eloquently about the importance of cultural diversity, but we live very much in a global economy, a global culture. So what is your vision for taking Canada global? The strategy has to be so much about the dissolution of the boundaries of the nation state, which still has, its important relationships about cultural funding. It's urban, it's provincial, it's also national. But so much of what is important for emerging generations of artists is to have those international relationships and for us to be open and comfortable with the internationalization of culture. So where are the boundaries of Canada in this era?
Well, I think the federal government certainly got embroiled in quite a situation in 2008 around the sort of DFATE, Prom Art Trade Routes funding, which I think was largely brought on by the vagueness over what those programs were supposed to achieve. And there were some people who really saw that as, what do they call it, cultural diplomacy. And there are other folk who saw that as cultural export. And more of that funding was on the cultural diplomacy side, I would say, than on the true cultural export side. So we ended up as a country scrapping the whole lot, unfortunately. And we haven't managed to return to that approach. And I suspect with the majority government now in Ottawa that there is the openness and opportunity to have that conversation about cultural export. I think the notion of what we invest in and why in terms of international work for artists is a really tough question. I think the cultural export challenge is, if it really is cultural export with profit attached to it down the road, why would the government support it? Because theoretically, if you could make money in Beijing, then go to Beijing, fly yourself over if you're going to make cash. So I think we need to sort of create within our training programs, and OCAD does this extraordinarily well, but in our other programs as well, what are the opportunities globally, and how do we pursue them? And in terms of Canada's role, I don't really have an answer about the cultural diplomacy thing. I know for certain we shouldn't use those words with the current government, but there definitely needs to be a broader visioning there, and I think there is a role for the government certainly to play a much more profound, have a much more profound presence in this area.
Thanks.
Thanks.
At Business for the Arts, we've recently been working on a research project with the Canada Council, where we've been having roundtables in a bunch of different Canadian cities with private sector arts funders, talking about funding the arts. And one thing that's come up repeatedly, and which also came up in the private sector roundtables we had as part of the Creative Capital Initiative as well, is that these arts funders, whether they are from the private sector or the public sector, they're not talking to one another very much, and there aren't platforms there for these funders to get together and chat. And I'm just curious, over your past 7 months, and all the meetings you've had with arts organizations, I'm just curious if they talk to each other. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are in terms of, if they are talking to each other, how to build on that, and if it's working or if it's not, and how it's contributing to the growth and change of the sector. And if they're not talking to each other, how can we start that? And if you think that'll actually be helpful in changing the arts and where it's going in Canada. Thanks.
I think there's sort of two mentalities that I find are unhelpful in the arts sector that are a bit more pervasive than I'd like to see them. One is a huge cynicism, which you have to be an optimist. Like, to run an arts organization, you have to be crazy optimist. If you're running an arts organization, for Pete's sake, like being jaded and cynical, that will go nowhere. So that's something we try to tackle a lot. And the other is this sort of scarcity mentality, so that any sharing of information, any sharing of donors, any sharing of any kind is actually helping your competitor. And I think we think much too much that way in the arts. Like, we're not collaborators as much as we need to be. And I think it creates, what I've really been impressed with the Creative Capital Initiative is how the community has really rallied around that. And it's impossible to write a report that satisfies everybody. Like, I've already heard from artists who read it and said, well, there wasn't enough of this, there wasn't enough of that. And I said, well, just read it again and think dancer. Well, there's no reference really to dance in the report at all. It's meant to be a sector-wide initiative. But I think overall, the community really has come together around that particular project. And I'm hopeful that that can continue in terms of ongoing dialogue and discussion, because it really is helpful. And I think, as you mentioned, the private sector's discussing funding priorities as well would be important. Where Chicago's done so well, for example, is Mayor Daley, before Rahm Emanuel became mayor, used to host a roundtable of private investors, private supporters, business leaders in the arts every quarter and talk about key priorities for the city and where they can put their money, and they align their resources, and as a result you see what's happened with Chicago. I think the hope would be something similar could happen in Toronto.
You talked a little bit about the baggage of elitism associated with major arts institutions. And it seems clear that those old hierarchies are viewed with increasing suspicion, and people don't want some curator to tell them what's worth looking at, and so on. So it seems clear that that is being eroded. But we also all live in in an era of information glut, and as you suggested, sort of a glut of cultural products as people make use of what Clay Shirky calls their cognitive surplus. Instead of watching TV, they make a YouTube video or whatever. So it seems also clear that there's a need or kind of a hunger for filters, or I guess to use sort of an old-fashioned term, tastemakers. So I guess I'm wondering what your take is on the role of big old traditional institutions when people want tastemakers, but as those old hierarchies of tastemaking are being kind of eroded and undermined.
Well, I think it's a constant evolution, and we always want to organize ourselves around those things. So the notion that we won't have tastemakers it's just not true, that it's going to be different people. For big institutions, when you look at sort of disruptive innovation theory, which looks at how sectors evolve over time, the theory with the big institutions is if they don't find a way to harness the emerging energy, they die. And what tends to happen in sectors is a new idea comes up and it grows over time and it dislodges the incumbent. So I think the real opportunity for Toronto, now that we've been through this, now that we've built the infrastructure, is to say, in the case of the ballet school, what are we doing in terms of partnership, like profound partnership with small, emerging, new ideas? And are we doing enough? And I think all of our larger institutions need to play more of a role in partnership with the emerging idea of the next, because the reality is the next leaders of the arts generation are 25 years old right now, and we need to find those people and put wind in their sails. And what we've unfortunately done in Toronto with the Superbuild, which is good from a global standing perspective, is we've built all these great facilities which cost a lot of money, but the money to invest in that next generation is now being sucked up into large infrastructure. So we need to take that large infrastructure and say, well, we have to find those 25-year-olds and we got to really invest in them. And we've been doing, I think, an okay job of starting that at the ballet school, but we really need the sector to start thinking that way. Let's find our next generation of young heroes and make them. And we can do it. We've got the private sector support, we have the arts institutions, we have the infrastructure, we have that opportunity. So I think we're going to need to start to do that, to use the larger platforms to help bring the new ideas forward.
My question is, making the note about how people should seek private funding. I feel that it might be a lot easier for larger cities to actually have access to that. And also, just reading the cultural plan from the Ministry of Tourism and how they're wanting to make Ontario a cultural hotspot internationally. However, a lot of the funding that they provide is based on organizations in Toronto. So I feel that other cities are getting marginalized through this process. Do you have a suggestion for smaller cities and how they can gain, capital as well?
I think, having come from Winnipeg, which is, it's a city where you collaborate or you die. You can't be a standalone institution without being in partnership, which is, I think, why Winnipeggers just sort of bring that to the table. They just assume that people work together. I think smaller communities is probably more acute. I think the notion of big is hard in a global context. Further to Sarah's question, when I started looking at the sort of cultural investment in Toronto, those numbers I was giving you in terms of percentage growth, the 2009 number. If you add up every municipally funded organization in the city of Toronto, the total is $309 million. That's the entire budget for every organization that gets a municipal grant. The budget for the Metropolitan Opera that same year was $285 million. So one US major institution is the budget of the entire arts sector in Toronto. So that's our competition. So when I'm talking about this scarcity mentality thing, like if we really want to be a global city and compete with cities like New York, which I don't know that we can, we have to start thinking at that level, not at the level we're at now where we have a bunch of smaller institutions fighting amongst themselves. And I think similarly with the smaller cities, your content can travel, so I don't think it's about, if you're in Brampton, there's ways to partner with the Rose Theatre and other venues, and we need to start thinking about that. What's the distinctive content? How do we partner with each other? And I think I'm looking forward to working in an institution like Banff, which really is a national collaborator, and hopefully Banff Centre can play a role in some of these smaller communities going forward.